I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to Bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elyse.
Hi, Kourtney.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing all right.
How does it feel to be a 5-year-old podcast?
It honestly feels very unreal. We've talked about this before, that during the time that we started podcasting, during the COVID-19 pandemic quarantine, when we couldn't go do theater, we were stuck in our homes, keeping people safe. And this podcast, like many, many others, emerged out of that time period. And we actually have surpassed many of those podcasts in terms of longevity. I think most podcasts, especially out of that period, had like on average 7 episodes, and we have over 100.
We've got like 140. We're almost 140.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I don't know what your, expectations were. I know we've talked a lot about like our dreams for the podcast and wouldn't it be cool, but I feel like I've also exceeded, I didn't have any expectations of how long this would last.
No.
But any expectations I could have had, it has far exceeded them.
I completely agree.
Now here we are with our Julius Caesar stuff to chew on, but before we get into that, we just have one quick item of housekeeping, and that is that we are celebrating our birthday, and for our birthday, we are offering new Patreon patrons 50% off of their first month through the end of January. You can get 50% off to join our Patreon and get access to bonus content as well as ad-free episodes with code HBD5. That's HBD, as in happy birthday, and then the number 5.
Yeah. It would be so great to see you all coming and joining us over at our Patreon to help us celebrate our 5th year of podcasting, because we are listener funded and listener support helps us greatly continue to produce this podcast.
Indeed.
All right. So now that we have shared our happy birthday celebration, let's go ahead and dive into this stuff to chew on for Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
For those of you who are new to the podcast, or if it's been a while, or if you've been with us since day one, this is a quick reminder about what the Stuff to Chew On episode looks like. Last time we released the Julius Caesar synopsis, which is the play-by-play of the play, so that everyone's on the same page. And now we are releasing our Stuff to Chew On episode, which is stuff to chew on about the play that you might encounter in an English class or a drama class, context, production history, themes, motifs, to help understand like the basics about this play beyond the text itself.
Think about this with the synopsis episode as your Julius Caesar 101 before we dive deeper into topics related to the play in future episodes.
Let's get started. So this play, Julius Caesar, is a tragedy when it is categorized based on the 3 genres of this time period. So tragedy, comedy, history. So you might be thinking, well, this play is about historical events. This play is based on a historical event, the assassination of Julius Caesar in Rome on March 15th, 44 BC. So why is this play, which is historical in nature, a tragedy and not a history? When we think about Henry V, which we just covered last year, that is a history, and that is classified as a history. However, like Macbeth, which is also based on historical events, Julius Caesar and Macbeth are not about English history.
Mm-hmm.
Julius Caesar is about Roman history, Macbeth is about Scottish history. So these are not the histories. It seems very convoluted, but this play is a tragedy.
And as listeners will know, just because it's based somewhere else doesn't mean that it doesn't have anything to do with England.
Yeah, that's a great seed to plant. In addition to this being a tragedy, that doesn't mean that modern critics look at this and think, oh, wow, we should keep this as a tragedy. Many modern critics also consider this to be a problem play. So that's a play that either has like a kind of mixture of two different genres, or there's something that makes it really hard to classify based on those stricter genre categories. There are so many complexities to what happens. For example, it is also one of Shakespeare's political plays. Julius Caesar is a play where the title character dies before the play is halfway over. As a modern reader, you could classify it in more complex ways, but based on like the folio, it's a tragedy. This play also is a relatively short play. It is just over half the length of Hamlet, which, as we discussed in our Hamlet Stuff to Chew On, is about 5 hours if you're reading it cover to cover. So it's not a short play, but it is short compared to some of his other plays.
Mm-hmm.
And this play is also considered to be a play that makes a moral question of its story. While in our synopsis we discuss what happened, from beginning to end, there are a lot of areas that readers and actors and theater makers and scholars can really get in and wonder about the moral quandary of this play. So, for example, should Caesar have been assassinated? And then also there's this idea that usurpation leads to civil war. And is there ambivalence within this play? So Caesar in some ways did and did not deserve to die. And it's unclear exactly in terms of like Shakespeare, what did he think? I don't know, but we have a lot of nuggets of ambivalence and characters with different conflicting opinions throughout the course of this play. And so it's a moral puzzle, which is very exciting for modern critics.
Yeah. And Roman history was a very popular topic to write about for playwrights and authors of Shakespeare's time. Specifically, the characters of Pompey and Antony were very popular to write about. For example, Thomas Kyd wrote 2 plays about Pompey's wife Cornelia. He had a translation of Robert Garnier's Corneille, titled Cornelia, in 1595, and wrote Pompey the Great, His Fair Cornelia's Tragedy, in 1595. Cornelia was the wife of Pompey. There were also 2 anonymous plays, now lost, about Caesar and Pompey that were acted by the Admiral's Company in 1594 and 1595. Mary Herbert, Countess of Pembroke, translated Robert Garnier's Mark Antony as The Tragedy of Antony in 1590, amongst others. This is just the beginning of a long, long list.
Yeah.
Now, Caesar had been, over the centuries, depicted as either a hero or a tyrant, Brutus as either patriot or assassin. Both schools of thought had been writing about this debate in books for a while.
Yeah.
For example, John Jaggard published an Italian book that viewed Caesar as a dictator and tyrant around the time that Shakespeare was writing. We will discuss this topic of a hero or tyrant, patriot or assassin, at greater length in our series. Roman history was very popular as we are coming out of the Renaissance, when popular culture is re-engaging with authors and writers and texts from antiquity and really celebrating the ideas from ancient Greece and Rome.
Yes. And in addition to that, authors and playwrights were also looking at these stories as ways to discuss political discourse within their own time period. So London in 1599 had sharp political awareness that it was possible to change the rigidity of rule, or what I mean by that is the nation's leader. At this time period, England was a monarchy. So it was possible to change the rule, the nation's leader, depending on certain circumstances. So they were interested in discussing ideas of tyranny, conspiracy, rebellion, deposition, death. If you remember, we talked in our Henry V series about Essex's rebellion, the summer of 1599, when Essex was sent away to Ireland for the wars and then came back and attempted to overthrow Elizabeth. And this was around the same time that Shakespeare was writing. And so this discourse was happening in London, and these plays were really seen as possible ways to have those discussions. 30 years before Julius Caesar, the homily against the disobedience and willful rebellion, so that would have been in like the 1570s, spoke out against rebellions. But by the end of Elizabeth's rule, there were these questions about the right of rebellion. And as far as using Greek and Roman classical texts, the Senecan tradition affected how some viewed rulers or how rulers wanted to be viewed. And so for Elizabeth had this idea that monarchs were transmuted into gods. And so Queen Elizabeth, like Caesar, had become a part of that tradition. So Caesar and Elizabeth were both viewed in the Senecan tradition as a ruler transmuted into a god. And so you have at odds this idea of people in England, political and common people, thinking about tyranny, rebellion, and then you have rulers like Elizabeth viewing their rule as something that was a tradition that like transmuted them from monarch into god.
Mm-hmm. Now, Shakespeare used some sources in writing this. Like many of his plays, as we've talked about before, he did not come up with this just solely off the top of his head. His primary source was Plutarch's Lives in Thomas North's English translation. This work helped Shakespeare with the lives of Caesar, Brutus, Antony, and their confederates, specifically their character and the events of their lives. In this work, Plutarch is much more interested in the moral character of these historical figures than political events. So, Shakespeare adapted, changed, reversed, compressed, expanded, and invented the order of events in this play. He also likely used additional resources, such as texts from classical historians like Suetonius and Appian, the Bible, and Ovid.
And some of these pieces we'll talk about more in depth. As Elyse said, how has this dialogue
shifted
and things like that. So we'll get more into that as well as like the sources in our series. But what I want to do now is I want to shift and talk about production history. So Julius Caesar was probably written to open the New Globe Theatre in 1599. So if you've listened to our intro series or know about that particular building, the Globe Theatre was transported from one side of the River Thames to the other side in Southwark, where we now associate Shakespeare and the Globe. And we have one particular account by Thomas Platter, who was a Swiss doctor from Basel, who wrote in 1599 in his diary, quote, "On the 21st of September, after dinner, at about 2 o'clock, I went with my party across the water. In the straw-thatched house we saw the tragedy of the first emperor Julius Caesar, very pleasingly performed, with approximately 15 characters. At the end of the play, they danced together admirably and exceedingly gracefully, according to their custom, 2 in each group dressed in men's and 2 women's apparel," unquote. So we have somebody who reported in their diary the day that they saw this play, and so we can trace back that this likely was performed in that time period, which is cool because some plays we don't have that information, so it's a lot of real guesswork.
We just covered Henry V last year, which is the other play that it is suspected might have opened the Globe, but we do know that by the time Julius Caesar was performed, the Globe was open, and it may be the one that is the first play.
Yeah. So
thanks, Thomas Platter.
Yeah, thank you. We've got little windows. And there also are references to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar that emerge in other plays in 1600. And we know about these because these plays were entered into the Stationer's Register in and after 1600. So, for example, Johnson's Every Man Out of His Humor, William Percy's Arabia Sitians, John Weaver's The Mirror of Martyrs, and The Life and Death of Sir John Oldcastle all have really what scholars think are apparent references to Julius Caesar, whether discussing Brutus or parts of Caesar, like just the references that scholars believe came from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And as you mentioned, Elyse, Henry V was also around the same time period. Many scholars believe that Henry V was written and produced before Julius Caesar, and so Julius Caesar actually lives probably in this really like great Shakespeare's work sandwich of Henry V. And then after Henry V was Julius Caesar, and then after Julius Caesar was Hamlet. And scholars think that Julius Caesar as a character must have been on Shakespeare's mind before he wrote Julius Caesar. And this is because Shakespeare references Caesar and Caesar's assassination in many of the plays that came before Julius Caesar. In his War of the Roses plays, he references Julius Caesar, which makes sense because those are about power and political conflict.
Mm-hmm.
But he also references Caesar in his comedies like Love's Labor's Lost and As You Like It. And then early in his career, he references Caesar in Titus. And then Julius Caesar stays on Shakespeare's mind, and he references not necessarily Caesar the character, but Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's play,
Mm-hmm.
in his own play in Hamlet.
Yeah. Doesn't Polonius say he played Brutus?
He did.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that the actor who played Polonius played Brutus, or if Shakespeare is just making jokes because Polonius is a dang fool.
Yeah. Well, hold on. So it's funny that, like, in Hamlet, Julius Caesar is mentioned. And if we take the anonymous poem, A Funeral Elegy on the Death of the Famous Actor Richard Burbage, as a true source of the roles Burbage played, which is where we do get the idea that he played Hamlet, the poem also lists him as playing Brutus. So in Hamlet, Polonius could be saying that he played Brutus while talking to the actor
guy
who
that played Brutus.
So it could be a joke.
Yeah. A very funny in-joke
Yes.
for the audience who saw Julius Caesar months beforehand.
Correct.
I love that. So we know that Julius Caesar was performed sometime in 1599, September, according to Thomas Platter. There also are recorded court performances in 1611 to 12 at Whitehall, and on January 31st, 1636 at St. James's, and on November 13th, 1636 at the Cockpit. And throughout these early productions, details of contemporary staging are unknown, but evidence of some classical costuming, including breastplates and plumed helmets, can be found. And you might be wondering, okay, so we've got these productions. What are the different publications of this text that we have that scholars go to? And the text as we received it is only in the first folio. So that is probably authorial, our only source from Shakespeare's time.
Kind of wild that, like, it wasn't published, with considering how popular. We have no surviving copies of additional publications of Julius Caesar. No, like, bad quarto of Julius Caesar.
Yeah, no pirated Julius Caesars, because it was so popular. The Shakespeare's Company must have kept that, like, prompt book
Under
really
lock
close
and
to
key.
them. Yeah. Someone's watching it, so no other company can perform the play. So that speaks to how popular this play was in Shakespeare's time.
All right. Now, what about the life after the first productions and the publication? What happens after Shakespeare's life? Well, Julius Caesar is popular for centuries. The first true critics of Julius Caesar were neoclassical commentators like Thomas Rymer and John Dennis, who, at the end of the 17th century, expressed dissatisfaction with the figure of Caesar, both in historical inaccuracy and his status as a minor role. And this sentiment was held onto into the 1700s. So, of course, people who were big fans of classics and Roman history nerds were upset that the adaptation was not accurate.
Yeah, they would not like the historical fiction section of Barnes and Nobles or your local independent bookshop.
No. With the exception of some late 1600s well-actuallys.
Some contrarians.
Again, the play was very popular, and Brutus was the hero of the play for 2 centuries, the 1600s and the 1700s roughly. Specifically, the Brutus and Cassius quarreling in a tent scene was very popular. Then, by the 19th century, there's a fresh examination of the wholeness of the play, which leads to the play emerging as an ensemble drama that's political and personal, rather than it being a quote-unquote bad dramatization of history. We see big names that are still recognizable today play and produce Julius Caesar, such as Dryden and Davenant, David Garrick, John Philip Kemble. We see performances led by actors of a commanding presence as Brutus, such as Lewis Hallam, John Henry, Thomas Cooper, the Booths, William Augustus Conway, Edwin Forrest, Lawrence Barrett, and others, and these were noted for their dignity, virility, and orotundity. And the Republican ideal, and that's the ideal of the Democratic Republic, was high. We also see a dynamic duo of William Macready as Brutus and Samuel Phelps as Cassius, a significant German production by the Menninger Company. Herbert Beerbohm Tree's production is noted for its realism, We have a notable production with Frank Benson at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre at Stratford-upon-Avon, Anthony Quayle and Michael Langham after the war, and Orson Welles, who pairs Julius Caesar to tell the story of the force of fascism. Additionally, rolling just a little bit back in time, young America of the Revolution and a little bit post the Revolution took inspiration from Julius Caesar for their libertarian passions of overthrowing a tyrannical government.
Yeah. Julius Caesar just really is full force in both Britain and America. Those are the productions that we're really talking about, are ones in Britain and America. And then moving further along in the 20th century, in the 1930s, Wilson Knight opened the way for the critics' long love affair with Shakespeare's ambiguity, a relationship that has continued into the 21st century. As Elyse mentioned, there are these ideals of like the democratic republic, and this idealism is really high. And there's this idea of dignity and virility. And then in the 1930s with Wilson Knight, this changes because there's ambiguity and there's some chief positions that then emerged about Caesar. One of them being continuing with Caesar as near royal greatness. The other is Caesar as a ruthless tyrant. Another one being Caesar has an ambiguous unknowableness. And then Brutus is a mistaken man full of faults. So these complexities, these ambiguities start to emerge as ways to interpret Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Then if we come to the end of the 20th century, there have been, according to the Arden, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar introduction, quote, far too many productions of Julius Caesar in the second half of the 20th century, unquote. So I am not going to list those because this play remains popular, and you could likely, I'm just making this up, this is not based on facts, but based on seeing playbills and season announcements, you can likely see Julius Caesar anywhere during the year, like at least once.
Mm-hmm. There will likely be a Julius Caesar near you.
Yeah. And the biggest principle of this period in the latter half of the 20th century is the growing importance of Caesar, not just Brutus and Cassius that Elyse mentioned earlier, and new historicists in America and cultural materialists in Britain in the 1980s began to also debate about subversion, subverting Julius Caesar and the text. And then in the same period, there are feminist critics who also wrote about the Elizabethan standard idea of Rome and that being identical to the ideology of maleness. And some notable feminist critics are Gail Green and Capelia Khan. And last, in terms of discussing the afterlife, this play has been performed in almost every decade and across the world. Modern adaptations usually take this play away from Rome and into another world in order to explore politics within the confines or the parameters of their own world.
Yeah, that's a fun fact. Here are some more fun facts. So one of those significant productions that we mentioned earlier, the 1864 production in the United States in New York that starred the Booths, Junius Jr., Edwin, and John Wilkes, in their only appearance on stage together, was a benefit performance that took place on the 25th of November, 1864, at the Winter Garden Theater in New York City. Junius Jr. played Cassius, Edwin played Brutus, and John Wilkes played Mark Antony. This landmark production raised funds to erect a statue of Shakespeare in Central Park, which remains to this day.
Yeah. And you went and saw this statue over the summer, didn't you? Yeah.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, you can thank the Booths.
Yeah.
Another fun fact about this play is that the play suggests a scheme of day, night, day in duration. And the play begins on Lupercalia, which is February 15th. And then it jumps to the Ides of March, which is March 15th. So not 2 days. So even though there is this suggested day, night, day duration within the context of the play, the holidays that Shakespeare is using are a month apart. And this could be some sort of just mistake that Shakespeare made or some oversight or something like that. But actually, and now I'm but actually, scholars have noted that at the end of the 16th century, there was a struggle of warring calendar systems in Europe where the Julian calendar was practiced by Protestants in England, and a different calendar, this quote unquote new style, was practiced by Catholics. And the reason there were two warring calendars is because the Julian calendar led to lost days, where the days in the year were not lined up with the seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Catholics practiced a different calendar to make up for those lost days. And the Protestants did not want to adapt this new calendar and make up for it. And so there is this in England around this time, this sense of like,
what day is it?
what day is it? And so Shakespeare could have written this in intentionally to speak to the fact that there were these warring calendars and it was hard to tell what day it was in the year due to the lost days in the Julian calendar. And we see this specifically in 2:1 when Brutus needs to know what calendar he is working under. So yeah, this strange inconsistency with day, night, day, and then one holiday to the next could be speaking to the kind of chaos of the year that Elizabethans were feeling when they too could not necessarily tell what calendar they were working under.
And our last but not least fun fact, most of Shakespeare's tragedies are named for their prominent hero. Think Titus Andronicus, think Romeo and Juliet, Antony and Cleopatra, Othello, Macbeth, the character that we essentially are introduced to and then follow until their demise. However, Julius Caesar breaks this rule. The title character is in only 5 scenes and dies in Act 3 halfway through the play. So Shakespeare might have been playing with structure here. Now, let's discuss the major themes of this play.
The first major theme is fate versus free will. And Julius Caesar raises many questions about the force of fate in life versus the capacity for free will. And we see this in many different characters. So the soothsayer and Calpurnia foretell Caesar's death. That does come to be. So that is fate. But then there's also characters like Cassius, who refuses fate and chooses instead to believe in free will. Cassius says, quote, "Men at some time were masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings," unquote. So while there are characters that accept fate, Cassius is one that refuses it and speaks to that debate between fate versus free will.
We also have the theme of the public self versus the private self, that we can have two separate identities. And much of the tragedy of the play comes from characters, especially Brutus, ignoring or going against their private relationships and feelings, and instead choosing to do what they feel is a greater public good. Cassius plays on the idea of Caesar's assassination being for a public benefit, an ultimate good, in order to win Brutus to his side. Brutus also tells the conspirators to act like actors, literally separate their private self from what they are doing, and to ignore their internal feelings to do it.
Another theme is misinterpretations and misreadings. So characters fail to correctly interpret the omens they encounter. For example, Cassius's forged letters create a quote-unquote misreading for Brutus when Brutus is not able to tell that they are fakes. And this inability to read people and events leads to the downfall of characters. Reading people and situations correctly is essential to survival in the politics of Rome, and many of these characters are not able to do it. And as I said, it leads to their downfall.
We also have the theme of inflexibility versus compromise. Think about Brutus and Cassius and how stubborn and stuck in their ways and their beliefs they are, and they end up suffering for it, being unable to adapt to the situations that they are now in, and ultimately to work together to win the war. Versus Mark Antony's ability to adapt to situations, which makes him a very successful politician and able to forge alliances, which ultimately win his side the war.
Another theme is rhetoric and power. Words are power in the world of Julius Caesar. Caesar is able to make things happen with just his words. Brutus sways public opinion with his speech, only to have Antony whip the crowd into a frenzy against the conspirators moments later via the power of persuasive rhetoric.
We also have the theme of ethics versus politics. Tension in the play arises due to questions over the ethics of Caesar's position of power, and that being complete power, and public anxieties over him becoming more power hungry, turning into a tyrant. Brutus is able to convince the public that killing Caesar was the ethically correct choice because, in a sort of trolley problem, we stopped him from becoming a tyrant and making our lives worse. However, as you just mentioned, Kourtney, Antony is easily able to undo that convincing via his political maneuverings.
Another theme is tyranny. So this play centers around the question of what makes a tyrant. Brutus has to convince himself that Caesar is a tyrant, or he will inevitably become one, before he agrees to the conspiracy.
And last but not least, we have the theme of honor. In the Rome of Julius Caesar, honor is a central concern for our characters. It comes from being selfless, rational, and proud. And very notably, Brutus is an honorable man.
Mic drop.
It's still up here from 20 years ago.
Yeah. I love that. I do love that speech.
Yeah.
Listeners, last but not least, we have our motifs for Julius Caesar. The first motif is omens and portents. Nightmares provide a regular reminder of Caesar's impending doom before his death. And there's even a moment where Cassius doesn't think that Caesar will actually come to the capital because of the Night of Terrors and these omens. And so omens and portents have massive meaning within the context of this play.
Letters are also a recurring motif throughout the play, and they provide a contrast to the spoken rhetoric and the impact of the spoken word. A speaker can change their rhetoric based on the response from their audience. Think about how Mark Antony, again, pivots through his speech to whip up that crowd into a frenzy. However, letters cannot. The effect of letters is dependent on the recipient's ability to understand and their response to the letter.
And our last motif is sickness. Caesar has a literal illness, epilepsy, but the conspirators also compare him to an illness that will infect the country. And this equating of Caesar to an illness goes back to what you were talking about, Elyse, of we're going to get rid of the sickness before it really starts to sicken Rome. So we're going to be preventative about it.
And that is it for our stuff to chew on for Julius Caesar. As Kourtney mentioned, we are going to be diving deeper into some of the topics we mentioned, as well as others in future episodes, so stay tuned. And thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From All's Well That Ends Well, Act 2, Scene 3, said by Parole. Aye, sir,